In this video, I'm ranking every single Battlefield game in the history of the franchise into a tier list. We're looking at the whole package here: single player, multiplayer, graphics, and fun level. Let's get started. The original entry into the Battlefield series, Battlefield 1942, was one of the first ever large-scale multiplayer FPS games based on World War II. This version of Battlefield opened up the floodgates for 20 plus years of combined warfare with infantry and vehicles and has inspired countless games since launching. The game featured 16 multiplayer maps with up to 64 players in a server spread across a giant map, which was pretty revolutionary for the time, especially given the scope of each map and the limited internet capabilities of the early 2000s. If you wanted to, you could also play offline with bots if establishing a stable internet connection was a problem. Later on in its lifecycle, 20 more maps were added through DLCs and patches. Not only did Battlefield 1942 have a lot of multiplayer content, but it also had a single-player campaign based on World War II. The campaign featured most of the major battles, including Operation Market Garden and the Battle of Iwo Jima. Multiplayer in 1942 featured a class-based system with a total of 5 classes, each with a different role allowing for player expression. These initial classes were Scout, Assault, Anti-Tank, Medic, and Engineer. Aside from kickstarting an incredible 20-plus year franchise, 1942 also included probably the most famous Battlefield map in the series, Wake Island, which has made its way back into multiple later titles. The game also included 2 expansions, The Road to Rome in February of 2003 and Secret Weapons of World War II in September of 2003. We have to give credit to 1942 for being the first game that kicked off one of the greatest FPS game franchises in history, but by itself, it was of course lacking some of the key features expected in a modern day Battlefield, so we're going to rank it in the B tier. Battlefield Vietnam had even a stronger focus on multiplayer compared to 1942, with only a handful of campaign missions. Fortunately though, most of the online maps were based on actual battles from the Vietnam War, such as the Battle of Hue, Operation Flaming Dart, and the Fall of Saigon. Battlefield Vietnam introduced new vehicles, new weapons, and customizable classes. Jets and helicopters were among the new vehicles, and weapons included classics like the AK-47 and M16 assault rifles, the M79 grenade launcher, and the M40 bolt-action sniper rifle. A new innovation in the series, customizable classes allowed you to select one of the 4 main classes and then switch some of the weapons for alternate ones. Just like with BF 1942, Vietnam had offline battles with bots, but the AI for the bots is thought to be some of the worst AI systems in history, even for the early 2000s. At random times, the bots would parachute out of helicopters, letting it crash into the ground, which meant that you had to pay attention to helicopters above you or one might just crash onto you. The game launched with 18 maps, 5 of which were used for the Evolution game mode. No DLCs were released for Battlefield Vietnam, although a World War II mod was later added by DICE by reusing some of Battlefield 1942's content, which added a few new maps and some new weapons. Overall, Battlefield Vietnam provided a fun way to get into the Battlefield franchise, and it expanded upon some of the elements that made the first game so revolutionary. We're going to rank it in the B tier.
Satellite scan. Camera deployed. Link establishing. Satellite coming down in 3, 2, 1.
Battlefield 2 was the first modern setting Battlefield game in the series. This one brought some new mechanics that were revolutionary for the time. The story was based on a fictional war in 2007 where the United States, Europe, and the UK battled Russia, China, and the Middle Eastern Coalition, also known as the MEC. This was the first version of Battlefield to feature a commander role. One player per team could take a bird's eye view of the battlefield and call in artillery strikes, send in supplies, and tell leaders of each squad what to focus on. The squad leader could then give these orders to their squad to choose which fights to take on the field. This version of Battlefield had some hilarious glitches, especially early on, and the patch sizes were enormous for the time. It wasn't uncommon to be out of commission for a full day or more just trying to update your game. This was also the first version of Battlefield that featured a defibrillator for the medic class, which would allow medics to revive downed teammates. This innovation made squad combat much more effective, since a solid squad with players filling each key role could be a major force on the battlefield. It also paved the way for the medic revive mechanic, which has become a staple of the Battlefield franchise. Multiplayer contained a whopping 7 classes, the most of any version of Battlefield. These included Assault, Medic, Anti-Tank, Engineer, Support, Special Forces, and Sniper. Later titles would combine these individual classes into multi-purpose classes that served the multiple in-game functions. Outside of the main game, BF2 had 3 expansions: Special Forces, Euro Forces, and Armored Fury. The ranking system to get up to maximum rank was hilariously slow compared to modern Battlefield games. Just like with most of this list, vehicles in BF2 were commonly a huge force on the field. A talented duo in an attack helicopter could dominate the skies, and a team filled with strong tank and APC players could make ground play a nightmare for the opposing team. Overall, Battlefield 2 was a huge innovation in the series, and it paved the way to many of the systems that Battlefield players are accustomed to today. We're going to rank it in the A tier. If you're enjoying this video so far, by the way, maybe subscribe. It's free to do, and you can always change your mind later. Battlefield 2 Modern Combat was the first Battlefield game to appear on console and was based on a fictional conflict between NATO and the People's Republic of China. This particular title was released in between console generations, where it launched in the fall of 2005 on last-gen PS2 and Xbox, as well as the next-gen Xbox 360 in the spring of 2006. This variance in hardware caused some dramatic differences in the gameplay experience depending on which platform you played on. The PS2 and Xbox versions of Modern Combat had some pretty bad graphics and performance thanks to the hardware limitations. However, the Xbox 360 version of the game was much closer to what high-end PCs were able to produce playing Battlefield 2. The single player introduced an interesting feature where players were able to swap between different soldiers in the campaign, similar to modern-day games like Grand Theft Auto 5. Overall, Battlefield Modern Combat was basically a mediocre Battlefield game, and that's why it's going to land in the C tier. Released in 2006, Battlefield 2142 was DICE's take on a futuristic multiplayer experience, as well as being the last PC-exclusive Battlefield title. Due to the level of class customization, 2142's class setups became a staple for all Battlefield games moving forward. The game launched with 10 maps, but 7 more were added later through expansions. The 4 classes, Assault, Engineer, Recon, and Support, were a wise simplification compared to the 7 classes of Battlefield 2. Each one had multiple unlocks and special gadgets that set the classes apart. Class-specific gadgets included squad beacons, recon drones, landmines that would track enemy vehicles, and many more. Squad leaders also had specific gadgets that caused members of the squad to respawn more quickly. This was an interesting development that made having a good squad leader feel important. They also improved squad cohesion by encouraging squad members to stick closer to their leader to get the most out of this gadget. Squad leaders also had a flying sentry drone, which allowed squad members to designate a target for the drone to fire upon, as well as a recon drone that provided spotting of enemy infantry. Each class had about 3 different primary options. Recon had 2 sniper rifles and a carbine rifle, Assault had a few assault rifle options as well as a rocket and an underbarrel shotgun, Support had a few LMG options and later on a primary shotgun, and finally the Engineer had anti-tank rifles and a rocket launcher. 2142 introduced a ton of futuristic vehicles, including mech suits called walkers, multiple tanks, small cars, hover tanks, gunships, and massive airships called Titans. In particular, there is a game mode called Titan, where players captured missile silos that slowly took down the shields on an enemy Titan airship. Once the shield was broken, players could board the ship to destroy the Titan's 4 control consoles and eventually its central core. This mode quickly became a fan favorite as it essentially became a hybrid of Conquest that turned into something more like Rush as the match evolved. Overall, 2142 was a dramatic shift from the typical Battlefield title, but it was received pretty well by the community for what it offered. We're going to rank it in the B tier.
Deep within the U.S. Army exists an elite force deployed for precise tactical operations. These are the men. Who are totally not the guys I was just talking about.
I know what I'm doing. This is a shortcut. You know what you're doing. You know what you're doing. If I had a penny for every time you said that, I wouldn't be needing this gold.
Battlefield Bad Company was the first Battlefield game to diverge from the typical nameless soldiers and instead focus on building a real connection to the characters that you play in the game. It was the first story-based version of a Battlefield game, which is a major departure from the typical Battlefield games that came before it. You play as Preston Marlowe, who was a recently transferred member of the US Army to the B Company of the 222nd Army Battalion, known as Bad Company. Along the way, you fight alongside a group of misfit soldiers, Samuel Redford, Terrence Sweetwater, and George Gordon Haggard Jr. Each of these guys were full of personality and ready to accompany you through a lighthearted and fun war story against the Russian army, the Middle Eastern Coalition, and the Legionnaire mercenaries. It was also the first Battlefield game to feature the now infamous Frostbite engine, a revolutionary breakthrough in game engine technology that allowed for the total destruction of the game world while still retaining high playability. This first iteration of the Frostbite engine still impacts gaming today, especially with games that include destructible environments. With the leap forward in technology presented by Battlefield Bad Company, along with a unique, lighthearted, and comedic story and a decent multiplayer experience, we're gonna rank it in the B tier.
Well, yeah.
Battlefield Heroes was the first free-to-play Battlefield game that traded in the typical drudgery of war on a bloody battlefield for something closer to a Saturday morning kids cartoon. This may seem like an odd choice for a game franchise known for being an accessible war simulator, and it was, despite offering a fun and frantic gameplay third-person shooter experience. Instead of the darker design of titles like Bad Company, the aesthetics of Heroes more closely resembled an early Fortnite design with bright colors. Similar to Fortnite, the game even featured a wide array of cosmetics for players willing to open up their wallets and wear them in the game. The main appeal was a lightweight requirement on your PC that made it possible to run on a variety of systems. However, in typical EA fashion from that era of free-to-play gaming, Heroes turned into essentially a pay-to-win simulator before getting shut down for good in 2015. The fan-run Revive network also later got shut down by EA. Battlefield Heroes ran on the same Refractor 2 engine from Battlefield 2 and 2142. In the end, it was a fun but simple game and probably a bit ahead of its time. Maybe it would have been even more popular if it was released closer to the modern day. We're gonna rank it in the C tier. Battlefield 1943 was an updated take on Battlefield 1942, but this time on console only instead of PC. This title was all about multiplayer, with no single player or story included. Overall, it was a very small game with just a handful of maps, vehicles, and weapons, yet this version of Battlefield set the stage for some huge Battlefield titles to come, like Bad Company 2, as it was the first game built on the Frostbite 1.5 engine and almost felt like a tech demo for that target audience. However, the game did excel at the one thing it was created for: chaotic and classic Battlefield combat with some excellent music choices to add to the ambiance. The game featured 3 classes, Rifleman, Scout, and Infantry, and you could also drive or pilot 4 vehicles, each of which were faction-specific. Battlefield 1943 improved the destructible environments of Bad Company and now allowed entire buildings to be destroyed along with larger-scale destruction and terrain deformation. All in all, 1943 was a solid yet simple multiplayer experience on console, but not much beyond that. However, it is still played today and somewhat popular to this day considering its age. We're going to rank it in the C tier. The second Bad Company game in the franchise was once again a stab at developing a version of Battlefield focused on story, character development, and this time with a slightly darker and more serious campaign tone. In the single-player version, you're reunited with the same cast of outfits from the first Bad Company game, albeit this time featuring some better dialogue. The scope of the campaign was much wider than the previous titles, ranging from close-range battles to tank missions to piloting a UAV to on-rail shooting from the top of a Humvee. As another game built on the Frostbite 1.5 engine, the graphics were stunning for the time and rivaled basically any other FPS game for its generation visually. It also improved upon that beloved environmental destruction. In typical Battlefield fashion, the multiplayer is where this game really shined. It even featured some excellent animation work, going for a more exaggerated and stylistic look. Combat consisted of 4 main class types: Assault, Engineer, Medic, and Recon, similar to the modern-day Battlefield titles. Game modes included a new squad-based Rush and Deathmatch along with the typical offerings of Rush and Conquest. The game also received an expansion called Bad Company 2 Vietnam, which takes action inside the Vietnam War with some new vehicles, weapons, and gadgets more fitting for the era. This was similar to the earlier Battlefield Vietnam title, but this time in the Bad Company 2 scale. All in all, there's good reason that Bad Company 2 is remembered as a favorite entry in the Battlefield franchise. We're going to rank it up in the A tier. Battlefield Online was a free-to-play remake of Battlefield 2 but with worse visuals and a pretty lackluster player base developed for the East Asian market by developer studio NeoWiz Games. Out of all the games on this list, I'd guess that this one is the least well known of the franchise. Supposedly, DICE wasn't closely involved with the project, which probably explains the incredibly subpar graphics, especially compared to Bad Company 2, which was released during the same time frame. This version of Battlefield was also developed on the older Refractor 2 engine, the same one used on older titles like Battlefield Heroes, 2142, and Battlefield 2. Along with the less than stellar graphics, it also featured a number of technical issues and a fairly short lifespan of only about 3 years. EA eventually shut down the project in 2013, probably for the best. Overall, it was a forgettable entry in the franchise. We're going to rank Battlefield Online in the lowest tier, D tier. Battlefield Play for Free was yet another title built on the aging Refractor 2 engine, vying for the crown of the worst Battlefield game ever created. The game took place in the same setting as Battlefield 2, a modern warfare scene with a fictional conflict between the United States and Russia, and it featured only an online multiplayer mode with no single-player campaign. Play for Free featured a total of 8 maps, featuring 2 originals and 6 updated variants from Battlefield 2. It also contained 3 game modes: Conquest, Conquest Assault, and Rush. Along with the dated graphics, the game also suffered from some technical issues like micro-stuttering and an overall clunky feel, and probably the most frustrating, a pay-to-win system where the unpaid game progression would unlock items at a glacially slow pace, and buying items and weapon upgrades with real money was absurdly expensive, to the point where it just made more sense to spend that money on a different version of Battlefield. With the poorly designed pay-to-win system, technical issues, and subpar graphics for the era, we're going to rank Battlefield Play for Free right next to Battlefield Online in the lowest tier, D tier. Battlefield 3 served as a much needed reset button for the franchise. This version of Battlefield launched with a brand new Frostbite 2 engine. To this day, I can still remember my jaw hitting the floor when I first saw the gameplay trailer. It looked like a high-budget Hollywood movie compared to most other games at the time. Trailers for Battlefield 3 are still worth watching to this day. They are truly stunning and a testament to some of the best marketing for any Battlefield game in the franchise's history. The single-player campaign featured stunning graphics but a somewhat underwhelming story. However, it did offer a co-op campaign separate from the single-player story, which was a nice benefit. The real meat and potatoes of this Battlefield game, though, was no doubt the stellar multiplayer experience. Many Battlefield veterans consider BF3 to be the best multiplayer of any Battlefield game in history, and in many ways I would agree. In particular, one of the best moments in any FPS game to date is the base jump section of Dam of Van Peak while playing Rush. Seeing an entire team of attackers jumping off a gigantic cliff and assaulting the next base is something special in gaming history. BF3 featured a large variety of weapons, gadgets, and vehicles for multiplayer, and had 4 classes to pick from: Assault, Engineer, Support, and Recon. Multiplayer included a total of 9 maps in the base game, and up to 29 total maps if you include each of the 5 expansions. In particular, Operation Metro became an instant fan favorite, still played by thousands of Battlefield fans today. It was perhaps also one to be credited as starting the modern meat grinder style of gameplay like you might find in Battlefield 4's Operation Locker 24/7 servers. Each expansion also had a direct theme. For example, Close Quarters doubled down on the CQB style of fighting, Armored Kill provided large vehicle warfare, and Back to Kharkin included a few fan favorite maps and weapons from Battlefield 2. All in all, Battlefield 3 was certainly one of the strongest titles in franchise history and was a fan favorite for good reason. We're going to rank it in the highest tier, S tier. Battlefield 4, launched in October of 2013, was the first game released on the modern-day Frostbite 3 engine, another leap forward in technology that would power the next several Battlefield iterations. It was also the first Battlefield game to be released on the PS4 and Xbox One platforms in late 2013. Despite the excitement of a new game engine and new consoles, Battlefield 4 actually had a pretty rough start. It was plagued by numerous technical issues on launch with connection errors, glitches, and dodgy netcode. It wasn't uncommon to get killed around corners in the first month of the game's launch. Luckily though, with some diligent work by the developers, the game made a full recovery and to this day is considered to be one of, if not the, best Battlefield games of all time. Although, some glitches like the crouch slide glitch still do exist to this day and are commonly seen as bannable exploits in public servers. On the bright side, Battlefield 4 opened up the floodgates for creative player expression and popularized the only in Battlefield type moments like a tank getting boosted up in the air and shooting a jet out of the sky. The game featured an improved single-player campaign experience over that of Battlefield 3, with stunning graphics and a wide variety of missions. Multiplayer had the same classes as BF3, Assault, Engineer, Support, and Recon, and a total of 10 maps featured in the base game, with several more added across a slew of expansions. One of the elements that drew so many fans to love this particular Battlefield title was the plethora of weapons, gadgets, and vehicles available to tinker with and customize to your heart's desire. The game included over 80 available weapons, each with its own set of accessories and attachments, as well as more than 50 available vehicles, many of which can be highly customized. Of note, one of my absolute favorite weapons in the game, the Phantom Bow, was a hidden Easter egg behind an incredible secret quest. I won't spoil it here for you, but if you haven't heard the story of how to acquire this legendary bow the original way, you're missing out. Luckily though, for new players, it's much easier to acquire these days. Outside of the original quest to earn the Phantom Bow, the game also has some excellent Easter egg surprises for dedicated players. Notable features in BF4 included Levolution, an upgraded version of the destructible environment system that radically changes the map geometry, like taking down an entire skyscraper in the middle of Siege of Shanghai, a commander mode returning from Battlefield 2 that gave one player per team an overhead view of the battle with the ability to resupply and give orders to troops, a field upgrade system that provides special perks to squads who can stay alive and level up their specializations, a test range that allows players to practice with various weapons and vehicles, and a community test environment allowing players to play a different version of the game and give feedback to the developer before the changes get rolled out to the official game. All in all, it's clear to see why Battlefield 4 became an absolute community favorite title, and I think it certainly earns a top spot in the S tier.
SWAT team, move in. 480 in progress, high-speed pursuit. Need backup, taking heavy fire. Officer down, officer down.
Battlefield Hardline provided a fun twist on the traditional army vs. army version of other Battlefield games, where typical soldiers were replaced with police and criminals. This was the first and only game in the Battlefield franchise developed by the studio Visceral Games. The single-player campaign is structured as a TV police drama which takes place around Los Angeles, California. Certainly an interesting take on a Battlefield campaign, but not one held in high regard by many purist Battlefield fans. Multiplayer introduced a few new modes around the cops vs. robbers plotline: Heist, Blood Money, and Hotwire. It also offered 4 classes which mimicked those of Battlefield 4. Operator was most similar to the typical assault class, Mechanic which filled the engineer role as well as having a satellite phone as a mobile respawn point, Enforcer which was essentially the support class but this time with heavy battle rifles and shotguns, and Professional which was the sniper class with bolt-action rifles and DMRs as well as some surveillance and trap style gear. Another big deviation from traditional Battlefield games was the lack of focus on large vehicles controlling the map. Hardline had choppers and some ground vehicles, but it didn't have the typical jets, attack choppers, and tanks found in most other Battlefield games on this list. Instead, the focus was heavy on cars, which could actually include some powerful weapons like RPGs stashed away in the trunk, making them extremely useful. The game also featured a hacker mode, which was essentially like the commander role of past Battlefield games, but this time it was equipped with tools like GPS jammers, overclocks, and Trojan horses to fit the hacker theme. Overall, I personally had fond memories of playing Battlefield Hardline with friends, and it was certainly full of laughs. I have to give it credit for trying something new and original in the franchise, however, compared to some of the more serious and polished Battlefield games on this list, it's hard to rank it super high. I'm going to put this one in the B tier. Battlefield 1 takes us back to the earliest historical era ever covered by a Battlefield game, World War I, as well as some conflicts with the Russian Civil War. This title was another candidate for the best marketing of any Battlefield game in the franchise. The trailers leading up to the game's release were unbelievable. They really are worth watching just for fun, especially for the nostalgia factor. Battlefield 1 is filled with weapons, gadgets, and vehicles featured during this era of history, including some first-generation tanks, bi- and triplanes, and airships. We also experienced armored cavalry for the first time on the battlefield. Thanks to the heavy trench warfare nature of World War I, we also get to experience crowd control weapons like gas grenades and flamethrowers, as well as a wide offering of melee weapons to stab your way through the trenches. The single-player experience offers something new to the Battlefield franchise in the form of war stories, where you play through the lens of historical figures in locations like the Italian Alps, the Sinai Desert, and the Argonne Forest on each side of the war. Multiplayer featured some familiar class setups including Assault, Medic, Support, and Scout, which acted similar to Recon. Each class had access to gadgets that were fitting for that era of time. For example, Assault had anti-vehicle grenades and explosives to deal with tanks, and submachine guns or shotguns to win those battles in the trenches, while scouts had devices to gather intel on enemy locations and engage from further distances with sniper rifles. It also lacked the typical class-agnostic weapon categories from BF4 like carbines, DMRs, and shotguns that could be equipped from any class. In Battlefield 1, you are more tied down to the identity of your selected class. A new concept introduced in Battlefield 1 was the ability to play as an elite class. These replaced the typical ground pickups that you'd find in past Battlefield games like the AMR2 sniper rifle or MG32 grenade launcher for powerful suits that totally changed how you play the game. This was an attempt to add power units without making them too numerous on the battlefield. For example, you could run around the map as a pyromaniac with a giant flamethrower and a gas mask, a tank hunter with the insanely powerful 1918 Tankover anti-tank rifle, or a sentry with an iconic machine gun. These elite classes were insanely powerful and often required teamwork from multiple allies to take them down, or just a single bayonet charge, whatever works. Multiplayer maps introduced enormous behemoth vehicles such as giant blimps, trains, and ships that aim to even out an unbalanced server and try to help the losing team make a comeback as a last-ditch effort. One major criticism of the game was the lack of extreme customization options available in past titles like BF4. Instead of allowing a wide range of attachments, guns were fairly limited in how much you could alter the weapon loadout because they had preset archetypes and attachments. It also had a controversial sweet spot mechanic that allowed snipers to kill with a single body shot depending on the distance to the target. This was an attempt to make bolt-action rifles more useful in an infantry-focused Battlefield game and discourage the typical back-of-the-map camping sniper playstyle. On the bright side, BF1 had staggeringly beautiful graphics, portraying a war-torn atmosphere and mesmerizing dynamic weather systems. Overall, Battlefield 1 offered a unique gameplay experience in the franchise and has been mostly well received, although not quite to the same level as a few other titles. We're going to rank it up in the A tier. Battlefield 5 was yet another Battlefield title set in the World War II era. The game included many mechanics and features from Battlefield 1 and faced criticism from the community that was perhaps a bit too rushed out and too similar in nature to the feel of Battlefield 1. The single player included a collection of war stories just like BF1 that documented some of the lesser known World War II conflicts and locations around the globe. It also featured a co-op campaign similar to that of Battlefield 3 called Combined Arms, which allowed players to participate in missions like assassinating targets, capturing or arming objectives, and more. As far as multiplayer goes, Battlefield 5 featured a great departure from the standard class system by introducing combat roles which allowed players to choose upgrades along a skill tree to best specialize for particular situations. These combat roles served as upgrades to the traditional assault, medic, support, and recon classes. BF5 also expanded the operations mode from Battlefield 1 into Grand Operations, which split the match across the course of 4 fictional days. A new feature was added to the game where players could build up embankments to help control areas of the map. This was an interesting development, but perhaps met with mixed reviews from the player base. Similar to other Battlefield titles, the weapon and vehicle selection was tied to the historical era of World War II. This featured classics like the M1A1, M1 Garand, MP40, BAR, and the Kar-98. One major change though was the introduction of cosmetic items that would alter the weapon's appearance along with some functional changes like a sniper scope magnification level. Vehicles featured the typical early tanks and aircraft you'd expect, but with the caveat that ammo was now limited and non-replenishing, so you need to restock at supply stations. Instead of a premium pass or the typical added cost expansions, BF5 introduced Tides of War, which unlocked new content for players that expanded the overall storyline, but at no additional cost. I can't quite put my finger on exactly why this feeling comes up, but it seems to lack some of that typical charm associated with many past Battlefield titles. Perhaps it's because of the striking similarity and feel to BF1, which had come out so shortly beforehand, but it also seems to lack that special all-out war feeling of the previous titles. I think many players were hoping for another modern Battlefield game instead, myself included. Overall, Battlefield 5 is a decent Battlefield game, and it has generally mixed reviews across games media. It's a beautiful game that feels like it's missing some of what makes Battlefield special. We're going to rank it in the C tier. I'll be covering every bit of Battlefield 6 news that I can find as we await the next release, so be sure to subscribe. Once the game launches, we'll be able to see where it fits into the tier list, hopefully near the top.